Section 17 of the Wonderful Adventures of Nils. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Reading by Lars Rolander. The Wonderful Adventures of Nils by Selma Lagerlöf. Translated by Velma Swanston Howard. The Old Peasant Woman. Thursday, April 14th. Three tired wanderers were out in the late evening in search of a night harbour. They travelled over a poor and desolate portion of northern Småland, but the sort of resting place which they wanted they should have been able to find, for they were no weaklings who asked for soft beds or comfortable rooms. If one of these long mountain ridges had a peak so high and steep that a fox couldn't in any way climb up to it, then we should have a good sleeping place, said one of them. If a single one of the big swamps was thawed out and was so marshy and wet that a fox wouldn't dare venture out on it, this, too, would be a right good night harbour, said the second. If the ice on one of the large lakes we travelled past were loose, so that a fox could not come out on it, then we should have found just what we are seeking, said the third. The worst of it was that when the sun had gone down, two of the travellers became so sleepy that every second they were ready to fall to the ground. The third one, who could keep himself awake, grew more and more uneasy as night approached. Then it was a misfortune that we came to a land where lakes and swamps are frozen, so that a fox can get around everywhere. In other places the ice has melted away, but now we are well up in the very coldest Småland, where spring has not as yet arrived. I don't know how I shall ever manage to find a good sleeping place. Unless I find some spot that is well protected, Smirre Fox will be upon us before morning." He gazed in all directions, but he saw no shelter where he could lodge. It was a dark and chilly night, with wind and drizzle. It grew more terrible and disagreeable around him every second. This may sound strange, perhaps, but the travellers didn't seem to have the least desire to ask for house room on any farm. They had already passed many parishes without knocking at a single door. Little hillside cabins on the outskirts of the forests, which all poor wanderers are glad to run across, they took no notice of either. One might almost be tempted to say they deserved to have a hard time of it, since they did not seek help where it was to be had for the asking. But finally, when it was so dark that there was scarcely a glimmer of light left under the skies, and the two who needed sleep journeyed on in a kind of half sleep, they happened into a farmyard which was a long way off from all neighbours. And not only did it lie there desolate, but it appeared to be uninhabited as well. No smoke rose from the chimney, no light shone through the windows, no human being moved on the place. When the one among the three who could keep awake saw the place, he thought: "Now, come what may, we must try to get in there. Anything better we are not likely to find." Soon after that, all three stood in the house yard. Two of them fell asleep the instant they stood still, but the third looked about him eagerly to find where they could get under cover. It was not a small farm. Beside the dwelling house and stable and smoke house, there were long ranges with granaries and storehouses and cattle sheds. But it all looked awfully poor and dilapidated. The houses had gray, moss grown, leaning walls which seemed ready to topple over. In the roofs were yawning holes, and the doors hung aslant on broken hinges. It was apparent that no one had taken the trouble to drive a nail into a wall on this place for a long time. Meanwhile, he who was awake had figured out which house was the cowshed. He roused his travelling companions from their sleep, and conducted them to the cowshed door. Luckily this was not fastened with anything but a hook, which he could easily push up with a rod. He heaved a sigh of relief at the thought that they should soon be in safety. But when the cowshed door swung open with a sharp creaking, he heard a cow begin to bellow. "Are you coming at last, mistress?" said she. "I thought that you didn't propose to give me any supper to night." The one who was awake stopped in the doorway, absolutely terrified, when he discovered that the cowshed was not empty. But he soon saw that there was not more than one cow, and 3 or 4 chickens, and then he took courage again. "We are 3 poor travellers who want to come in somewhere where no fox can assail us, and no human being capture us," said he. "We wonder if this can be a good place for us." "I cannot believe but what it is," answered the cow. "To be sure the walls are poor, but the fox does not walk through them as yet, and no one lives here except an old peasant woman, who isn't at all likely to make a captive of anyone. But who are you?" she continued as she twisted in her stall to get a sight of the newcomers. "I am Nils Holgersson from Vemminghög, who has been transformed into an elf," replied the first of the incomers, "and I have with me a tame goose whom I generally ride, and a gray goose." "Such rare guests have never before been within my 4 walls," said the cow, "and you shall be welcome, although I would have preferred that it had been my mistress come to give me supper." The boy led the geese into the cowshed, which was rather large, and placed them in an empty manger, where they fell asleep instantly. For himself he made a little bed of straw and expected that he, too, should go to sleep at once. But this was impossible, for the poor cow, who hadn't had her supper, wasn't still an instant. She shook her flanks, moved around in the stall, and complained of how hungry she was. The boy couldn't get a wink of sleep, but lay there and lived over all the things that had happened to him during these last days. He thought of Osa, the goose girl, and little Mats, whom he had encountered so unexpectedly, and he fancied that the little cabin which he had set on fire must have been their old home in Småland. Now he recalled that he had heard them speak of just such a cabin, and of the big heather heath which lay below it. Now Osa and Mats had wandered back there, to see their old home again, and then when they had reached it, it was in flames. It was indeed a great sorrow which he had brought upon them, and it hurt him very much. If he ever again became a human being, he would try to compensate them for the damage and the miscalculation. Then his thoughts wandered to the crows. And when he thought of Fumle Drumle, who had saved his life, and had met his own death so soon after he had been elected chieftain, he was so distressed that tears filled his eyes. He had had a pretty rough time of it these last few days, but anyway, it was a rare stroke of luck that the goosey gander and Dunfin had found him. The goosey gander had said that as soon as the geese had discovered that Thumbietot had disappeared, they had asked all the small animals in the forest about him. They soon learned that a flock of Småland crows had carried him off, but the crows were already out of sight, and whither they had directed their course no one had been able to say. That they might find the boy as soon as possible, Akka had commanded the wild geese to start out, 2 and 2, in different directions, to search for him. But after a 2 days' hunt, whether or not they had found him, they were to meet in northwestern Småland on a high mountain top, which resembled an abrupt, chopped off tower, and was called Taberg. After Akka had given them the best directions and described carefully how they should find Taberg, they had separated. The white goosey gander had chosen Dunfin as travelling companion, and they had flown about hither and thither with the greatest anxiety for Thumbietot. During this ramble they had heard a thrush, who sat in a tree top, cry and wail that some one who called himself Kidnapped by Crows had made fun of him. They had talked with the thrush, and he had shown them in which direction that Kidnapped by Crows had travelled. Afterward they had met a dovecock, a starling, and a drake. They had all wailed about a little culprit who had disturbed their song, and who was named Caught by Crows, Captured by Crows, and Stolen by Crows.